How you doing, guys? Eric from worldofwasteland.com. This is the next installment in my review critique of the show The Last of Us, where I go through and try to see if there's any preparedness, survival lessons that we can learn from this fictional television show. I'm quite a few episodes behind because I've been traveling and whatnot over the past few weeks, but I will do them all still. So this is going to be episode 4, and I always make this disclaimer that obviously I know this is fictional, especially when you're dealing with zombies and fungus zombies or whatever, but there still is a lot of things that we can potentially learn, or at least think about, mental exercises, seeing these fictional scenarios, because a lot of the same elements would be present in real life scenarios, and it's just fun. So let's jump right in and see what we can learn from things that the characters did right or wrong in dealing with a shit the fan scenario. So I mentioned before how it was stupid of the guy, the main character Joel, not to arm the girl that he's traveling with, because obviously she's young, but she's supposed to be 14 in the show, well beyond the age where you should be, expected to and certainly can competently handle a firearm if you're trained. But you need to do that. And the show opens with the gun that she had found kind of surreptitiously squirreled away, and is futzing around with it, kind of practicing in a bathroom or whatever by herself, because the guy doesn't know she has a gun yet. And that's just one more reason why you would want them to know what they're doing. Is she could have some kind of accident if she's never dealt with it before, and when the situation arises that she may need to use it, she might not know how to use it, won't know how to clear jams, might not be able to hit what she's shooting at, and that stuff's very important in a scenario where ammo is probably extremely hard to come by, even though they left it all at the prepper compound. I'm gonna get over that. But yeah, anyone in your party should be armed if at all possible, and should be at least somewhat trained to the best of your ability. And one of the things that early in this episode is it shows him using gas from vehicles in that old gas station, because they have this car from the preppers compound truck. They make some sort of comment about how it's mostly they don't get great mileage because the gas is mostly water because it's so old. And I'm like, look, if this is gas, you'd have trouble with the water content and degradation of non-stabilized gas after 6 months to 2 years. You could have some serious issues just sitting out there in the open in a car's tank or whatever. 20 years after the fact, you'd be lucky if you're even getting liquid out of that thing. It'd probably be more like tar or turpentine, or just completely vaporized or completely water. It would be absolutely useless. And if you did have a running vehicle, the last thing you would want to do is put whatever came out of the tank of a car that had been sitting there for 20 years into your car, because that would certainly foul it up. A much better situation, if you could swing it, would be to have some kind of diesel engine that you have done the necessary things to be able to run the various kinds of motor oil, vegetable oil. You could find a lot more fuels that way, but simply putting 20-year-old gas wouldn't even be gassed up. A terrible idea, totally unrealistic, would never work, and it would destroy your engine. Another ongoing theme is they're very poor. Obviously, this is not necessarily unrealistic, because anyone who is, not in the military, didn't have any sort of specific training or interest in such things, is not very good at operational security. But this guy's supposed to at least kind of be, wise in the ways of the world, shrewd, whatnot. But they're just driving down roads. They're just traveling, talking loudly the whole time. Just, not using any sort of cover concealment, not having any noise discipline, not having any light discipline, while constantly referencing the fact that there's bad people out there. We know there's these zombies out there. So they're either completely stupid or it's completely unrealistic. Probably some combination of the two, because they're just cruising down the road. And most of these roads would be blocked off. If there were any people left, there'd be various kinds of roadblocks or tire hazards. And even for just fuel economy purposes, in most vehicles, you would want to hover around 50 to 60 miles an hour. The more aerodynamic the car is, and depending on the gearing, you could push that a little bit higher for pure gas, efficiency reasons. But you'd be doing some form of hypermiling driving, where you're driving at the right speed to where you're maximizing your speed without going any farther into wind resistance. And it's something like a pickup truck they have that's going to be around 50, 55 miles an hour. And fourth or fifth gear, whatever you can, cruising. And also another reason why you don't want to be going any faster than that is because if you're going 70, 80 miles an hour, the stopping distance on a car is pretty long. I'm talking 100 feet plus. And so any obstacle that comes up on the road, which is way more likely in a situation like this, where the it's all overgrown and everything. There could be roadblocks. So you don't have nearly as much time to react if you're going, or change directions or do anything if you're going 70, 80 miles an hour. And now it doesn't necessarily tell us how fast they're going, I don't think, but there definitely looks like they're going more than 55 miles an hour as they're cruising down the road. But maybe not. But it's something to think about if you're ever in that situation for sure. So they pull off in the woods to make a little camp, and I think he does reference something about them eating like 20-year-old Chef Boyardee, which is realistic. Like I've mentioned many times on this channel, canned goods, if the seal is not breached, can be edible pretty much indefinitely. That's what the science tells us. It will probably be mushy, bland, gross, but and not nearly as nutritious as it once was. Not that Chef Boyardee is particularly nutritious, but it will be edible, and it will be, you know, not dangerous and not contaminated for the most part. Shows him with a little propane camp stove, which we don't know exactly how long they're supposed to have been on the road. It's just a day or two, I think, at this point from when they picked up the truck. But, you know, that takes a reasonable amount of fuel, for sure. And they're in the middle of the woods. I would not be using a propane in a situation where wood was around that plentiful. A little rocket stove, like I just mentioned, the Kelly kettle in one of my last videos. I would pick up one of these, link in the description, and he could get the same amount of cooking done with a stack of twigs, you know, a bundle of twigs that you could fit in probably one hand, and not use any of your propane, which you could save for situations where you're in more of a hurry, you don't have enough wood around, maybe you're in a building, you know, taking shelter inside a building, whatever. I think they should be using wood in this situation. He does actually specifically mention that he's not starting a fire because he's worried that people will see, and that obviously makes sense. Like I said, there's the one rare instance of them worrying about OPSEC, but nothing else they do in these situations really indicates that they're that concerned about other people. He says the place is too remote for infected, but he's worried about other people. But they're just sitting around cooking, you know, banging around with the pots and pans, not really doing anything particular to, you know, stop people from knowing that they're there. And it's certainly possible to build a very small fire and shield it from all directions visually to where you wouldn't really be able to see it from more than a few hundred yards away. You can use the truck, you could set up tarps or something, you can build a little wall with twigs and whatnot. So if that's a real concern, you know, for sure you shouldn't be building a fire if you have an ability to use a little gas stove, but you should be doing a lot of other things differently too. And it cuts to the very next scene. They're setting up, you know, their bedrolls or whatever with a propane lantern just sitting there in the middle of this campsite with nothing blocking it. So it would be just as visible as a campfire, and as long, you know, assuming it's not a roaring inferno. So like I said, it doesn't really jive with what they're saying, what they're doing. And they're kind of just laying on the ground to go to sleep anyway. There's not really, you know, they don't have tents, they don't have shelters. So it'd be much smarter to, and they're right next to the truck. If you have a truck sitting there, I would you know, I would go off into the woods a little ways with like a bivy sack or something if you have it, or just a sleeping bag. And since you're just gonna be laying on the ground anyway, stay decently far away from the truck, and I would stay decently far away from each other if possible too. So if one person somehow is discovered or woken up, the other person isn't right there. And that goes for pretty much everything you're doing. A lot of times when people are walking, you want to, you know, create your distances, get your spacing right. Obviously for military purposes, you're worried about, you know, an ambush or a grenade taking out everyone at once if you're, you know, 6 feet apart. Whereas normally if you're traveling, you would want to be dozens of yards apart most of the time, just within range to where you could get to the person quickly if you need to where you can communicate easily, but far enough apart that when something happens to one person, you're not immediately caught up in whatever that is too. And especially like some kind of ambush, it would take a much larger group of people to encircle you or get the jump on both of you at once. And, you know, for people who aren't really paying attention, if you just stumble up on somebody, they're not even going to know the other person's there necessarily if you're 50 yards back, or, you know, at least should be around 15 in open space. It depends on visibility, obviously. But you definitely don't want, there's no reason to be right next to each other. That's not keeping them safer. In fact, usually it's going to be keeping them less safe, because if someone comes up on either one of you, they're coming up on both of you. So eventually they start driving up on, I believe it's St. Louis, and he does this, they have a map, which is good. You know, you'd obviously need to have some kind of a physical map. It's a lot more, they were a lot easier to come by in 2003 than they are now, but that's something I always have. I take with me on any kind of type of road trip. I always have a multi-state atlas. It's best to have a zoomed in, detailed map of the exact area you're going to be in, and then also have one that covers states and everything around you, so at least you know major terrain features, major highways, major roads, etc. So some of the ones that I have are obviously the state I'm in, which has much more detail going into the specific immediate area. And when you're in the edge or border, you should have one of the nearby states. Like I'm really close to Arizona, so I have those too. And then the actual all-state road atlas, which you can pop open any, and they're actually Kansas City, not St. Louis like I mentioned. But the link will be in the description to this, and you can see it has zoom-ins. Great thing to have. I would also just recommend, of course, having a compass of some kind, and it's also useful to have like a protractor or at least a little ruler, so you can get degrees, you can get distances, you'll have the scale, and then you can use this to figure out exactly what distances you're dealing with. Definitely recommend having that in your vehicle and during any sort of travel. Driving directly into a major city that you're not planning on specifically going to would be a terrible idea. Much more likely that there's a lot remnants of people. It's a lot more likely that the roads are blocked off. There's always ways around. Even if it added an extra few hours or day, I would absolutely avoid a major city, and they drive smack dab into the middle of it, and what do you know, they encounter problems. He gets out of the vehicle to assess an obvious roadblock, and then he grabs his bolt-action rifle out of the back seat. Terrible idea. He should have had it somewhere readily accessible from the front seat if necessary. So that's just more goofiness. And they come upon a place where the road's pretty much blocked off. So it's blocked off to where they can't drive through it. Theoretically, obviously that's something that I would have assumed was a possibility. Another thing that they don't ever have the characters really doing in these shows is driving like the wrong way on the road. You wouldn't really have to worry about following traffic rules for sure. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go the way that you would in a real world, current world non-shit-the-fan scenario. You could look at the map and say, like, what is literally the shortest distance, whether I have to drive over medians, go wrong way on exits or whatever, it doesn't really matter. So you do end up having to, divert around this tunnel, still driving. I think it would have been better. They do mention that they would have had to go way outside, but if you're talking about going outside a city, you're going to be driving on a highway, which is less likely to be blocked. You normally have some kind of shoulder, so I definitely wouldn't drive through. I mean, even the way they show it, the city's completely snarled with traffic, and you're much more likely to encounter any remnants of humanity there too, which is probably not what you want to deal with in this scenario. And sure enough, they accidentally roll right up on where the Fedra, or like the federal government station, was, and it's like burned out or abandoned or whatever, but they would have just rolled right up to the front gates accidentally if it was still operational. So that was a terrible idea. And then of course they come in contact with somebody who's pretending to be injured, and Joel correctly recognizes it as some sort of trap, and he makes the correct decision to just like drive through it, which is usually what you want to do in an ambush, is just to keep moving. You never want to stop. And they do get some people throw bricks on them and stuff like that, so the car ends up being somewhat disabled, or not somewhat, it's disabled because they blow out the tires, they shoot out the window and stuff, and they crash into like a storefront. And all the more reason why you would definitely want to have something more than a bolt-action rifle. You would want to have her arm, because even in a scenario where you can have someone just laying down cover fire, suppressive fire, some kind, having multiple targets for them to worry about, while you can put some aim fire back in their direction, because now he's facing what appears to be 4 or 5 guys who they have semi-automatic weapons, and he's just using a bolt-action rifle. Another time where those grenades from the first episode or second episode would have come in handy right about now. So lucky for him, these guys are not really well trained or well organized, and he ends up taking out most of them single-handedly, whereas if they had just had 1 or 2 guys lay down suppressive fire and had a couple more guys move around or move up on him while he's pinned down, he would have probably been cooked. And but he does end up taking out a few of the guys, and then he ends up having to like physically fight with the last dude, and the girl ends up actually having to come out from hiding and saves him with the gun that he didn't even want her to have. So like I was saying, perfect example of why it would be very beneficial to have most of the people in your party armed, and also why you want to make sure your hand-to-hand fighting skills and backup weapons, because he's like struggling with this guy. If he'd had a knife handy ready to go, could have stabbed the guy. If he'd worked on his jiu-jitsu skills, he could have just stood up. And so you definitely want to maximize your force potential, whether that's with multiple people armed, having multiple weapons yourself, multiple people having multiple weapons and skills, always a better idea. So then they proceed to leave pretty much everything that they had in the truck, which was, presumably everything they took from the Prepper's massive compound. So they again leave with like 1 or 2 guns. Doesn't even take the guns from the guys. These guys all had like semi-automatic weapons. Doesn't take any of those. Doesn't take any of the gear from the truck. Doesn't, obviously he's worried about people showing up. But in this type of situation, that stuff would be worth risking your life over. Every day you're out in this crazy scenario is risking your life. And to do so without these incredibly valuable resources would be more of a risk than taking a second to gather at least some of that stuff up right then and there before booking it out of there. So that's, like I said, constantly infuriating that happens in this show. And they do show a brief moment of now he's like, okay, maybe it's a good idea that the girl has a weapon. So he's kind of like goes through some really basic like training her on how to hold it and everything and use the gun, which he should have already done and could have avoided, almost dying. And but yeah, definitely their disregard for the importance of these resources and leaving stuff like guns and food and things behind is just completely inexcusable. I don't think you would have lasted 20 years in a scenario like this if you had that little regard for how important some of these resources are. But the rest of the episode is pretty much them, in the city evading this guerrilla type forces that have overthrown the federal government there and are now mad at them because they killed their guys. So not too many like more survival lessons from that specifically, other than, like I said, focusing on OPSEC and movement, which is usually terrible. That they're talking loudly, making noise, bunched up, and just gross in that respect all around. But this episode had some decent amount of things happening at least, so picked up the pace a little bit. Still a lot of lessons we can learn from it. So for me, the issue is still them just like not taking stuff that's super useful, not having good operational security and everything. But let me know what you guys think. If you notice anything from this episode that you think was a good survival prepping lesson, and then tune in for when I do the next episode. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you later.